Hi, I'm Alan Weckel, and I'm joined today by my colleague Chris DePuy from 650 Group. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking to you today about the technical drivers for your next RFP. As we go through this section, we have a bunch of people in the background for Q&A, so please type your questions in and one of our colleagues will answer them and get back to you. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass the beginning part of this presentation over to Chris.
Thank you, Alan. Okay, so my name is Chris DePuy, and as Alan said, I work with 650 Group, and I'm a technology analyst there. And what we're going to talk about initially here is what work from home is doing to wired and wireless networks, and then shift on to some other topics that relate to the wireless market. So here we go. So what's happening is we have this work from home phenomena that is underway right now. Everyone's heard of it. We all know what's happening. And what I think, at least from our standpoint, you can say is work from home is now the new normal. So what that means is there are going to be, and already are, changes to the way that we build campus networks and get our work done during the day. What we're showing on the slide here is what's happening with big company announcements that relate to the way that they're bringing people back to work. And these types of activities are changing the way that we need to build out our campus network. So you can see that Twitter is allowing customers to work from home forever. And some of the big financial companies are bringing some fraction of their workers back to the office, but not all of them. And in other cases, like in the case of Fujitsu, here they're going to reduce the number of buildings that they have down to half of where they were over the course of 3 years. And then I would say that, well, the folks at Google kind of represent what is now becoming the consensus, which is probably by about next summer, we'll start probably seeing people come back to work on a bigger scale. This is all subject to change, but that I would say is kind of what's built into our thinking when we're building out our estimates. And I would say that from an IT perspective, that seems to be the likely scenario that most people are contemplating. So let's talk about work from home a little bit more. What is happening is work from home is taking multiple paths. You can see that we've got 3 different scenarios that are playing out in our forecasts. So what can happen with employees who are working back at home is the company they're working with can purchase enterprise class gear, wireless LAN devices, for instance, or security devices, and drop ship them or otherwise get them into the hands of the employee. That person plugs them in and works as if they were in the office. This is very attractive. It is definitely something that's happening. In our research, we're seeing quite a bit of evidence that this type of purchasing trend is underway. On the other side of the chart, you can see this consumer gear. We've got a picture of regular consumer class Wi-Fi gear. And this is the kind of gear that people were using before the pandemic struck. And we're seeing that some folks are upgrading their home networks to add extenders, or they're purchasing mesh devices or calling their service provider to maybe get upgrades to this infrastructure so that it's more capable. But what's really happening here is that the consumer gear is not sufficient to deliver the type of connections and access to services that employees need when they're working from home. So we've got in the middle are cloud delivered services. And what's happening here is this is like a services layer that sits on top of the consumer gear that we have all been using at home. And I just want to drill into this point a little bit more. What's happening is that as we either bring enterprise class gear to home or use consumer class gear, cloud delivered services are really taking off. We see plenty of evidence of this in our research, and this drives us to the point that cloud managed devices and cloud delivered services are going to be a major growth driver for the work from home phenomena And that is going to be somewhat additive to a trend that was already in place, which is cloud delivered services and management is already a big trend that's underway within the enterprise. Okay, so what's happening is we are seeing new types of approaches that are being used to reduce the risk of people returning back to work. That is the contact tracing discussion I'd like to turn to next. So what is contact tracing? I'm pretty sure you've heard that there are sort of software or services systems that are being brought to the market that are being introduced at sort of like at the country level, meaning the US or Canada or India or whatever you have. And in many cases, these countries are working with their software giants who happen to be in their country, so that they can create a system that allows the notification of coworkers or family to know if they've had access to someone or been close to someone who was sick. Okay, that's what I think in the common use, that's the common use of contact tracing. Okay, so what's happening with contact tracing is that is not the kind we're talking about here for enterprises. So if you're an enterprise and you're running your business and you want to have visitors, visit your campus, or employees or contractors visit the campus and work there, what we're seeing these days is enterprises are now trying to protect themselves and their workers and visitors by using what is also called contact tracing, but it is an enterprise version of contact tracing. So this isn't tracking every citizen in the US or everybody in India or Canada. What is in fact happening is we're just tracking the people who go onto campus. This is very important because it reduces the risk to the company. In fact, what it's doing is making sure that if one employee gets close to another, you can notify them the next day, maybe prevent them from coming back, that kind of thing. So what I'm showing here is two different approaches that we're seeing be used in the current times. The first is crowd management. What this is like an overlay on top of wireless infrastructures. In many cases, what we're seeing being brought to the market, or at least discussed, is that it is sort of like a cloud service that runs on top of Wi-Fi networks or Bluetooth networks. And the idea is, how many people are in the room because they are carrying devices with them, and it can either tell contact security and say, hey, there's too many people in the room, better do something about it, or maybe there's an open or closed button, just like I've shown you on the slide here, or perhaps there's like a number counter outside the door. What this does is makes it possible that, like, if you have a lunchroom, you don't have 300 people in a place where you would only allow 25 people to be safely 6 feet apart and grabbing their lunch trays or whatever. So that's crowd management, and like I said, this is a cloud layer on top of a Wi-Fi network in many cases. And then of course there's contact tracing, like I was saying, in the context of the enterprise. And what I mean by that is what's happening is in some cases the existing Wi-Fi access points that may have Bluetooth or may not might be sufficient to run a cloud service that does enterprise contact tracing. Or in other cases, if the enterprise has older gear, they might have to purchase new hardware to allow this very valuable service to be run at the enterprise level. But the point of it is that you're going to have either employees with smartphones or employees with badges. Allow the wireless infrastructure to monitor them and make sure that they are being kept safe. So that's contact tracing. I'd like to now shift gears to something that we're seeing that is both exciting and a little bit confusing, and that is the emergence of unlicensed spectrum in the enterprise. I say it's exciting and confusing because we've had unlicensed spectrum in the enterprise for quite some time. That's where Wi-Fi runs on, primarily in the 2.4 gig and the 5 gigahertz spectrums. But we are seeing a real shift in what's happening, and I want to explore that a bit further with you. So here are all of the new options that enterprises have to work with in the future. First, we list 6 gigahertz. For those of you who are in the US or in certain parts of Europe, you're going to be seeing new unlicensed spectrum in the 6 gigahertz area. This will be additive to what is available for the Wi-Fi market. So we'll go from having Wi-Fi 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, we'll now be adding 6 gigahertz. This is a lot of bandwidth that's coming and will enable us to use Wi-Fi at very, very high speeds. And the other thing that's happening is because this is new spectrum, I would think for the first handful of years, it'll be considered clean, very clean spectrum, because the 2.4 and the 5 gig has been around for a while, and there are many, many billions of devices that use it. 6 gig will be kind of ramping out and will be, quite attractive because it's very unused. What is also happening is we have in the US CBRS. CBRS is the 3.5 gigahertz spectrum, which is where many countries are already deploying 5G cellular on. So CBRS is going to allow enterprises in the US to build out a cellular infrastructure that would run more than likely outside, but also sometimes indoors in certain vertical industries. And I'll speak a bit more about that in the next couple slides. What is also happening is we have licensed spectrum that is very similar to CBRS in the way it's being implemented in certain countries. In the UK and in Germany, for instance, these are examples of countries that are making available sort of enterprise level licenses that allow you to build out a cellular infrastructure. Now, there are also more spectrums to talk about which are being popularized these days. Good examples are 60 gigahertz. You probably have seen some of this technology discussed. We saw that in consumer products about 5 years ago, but there's a new version of Wi-Fi called 802.11ay, which is being brought to market. And this is going to be primarily used for backhaul, but it will find its way into the enterprise market as well. And I'll just say parenthetically, 900 megahertz brings yet another type of Wi-Fi. It'll be used for IoT. It's called 802.11ah. And so now the point of all of this is that we have lots of different options to choose from when building out an enterprise network, both indoor and outdoor. And it is, as I was saying, confusing. Okay, so I'd like to now discuss where all these things fit in to the enterprise. So I'm sure that you've seen the advertising or the media write-ups about the telecom industry with 5G coming. The chart I've shown here shows on the left what a traditional 4G or LTE network looks like. What this looks like is these operators purchase licenses through auctions with their government and then will sell their wireless service to consumers. That's what 4G is for the most part, and it's mostly smartphones that are connected to them. The service provider industry is saying in its marketing that it's trying to enter new markets beyond licensed consumer, and that's what I'm showing in these charts to the right. They, of course, are going to continue to offer things like 5G to consumers, and they view that their opportunity is to sell licensed 5G into the enterprise, as well as getting to fixed wireless access. That's what FWA stands for. And the challenge to this service provider entry into the enterprise is that we now have all of these unlicensed and shared license and, let's say, cheap license alternatives hitting the market right at about the same time as 5G is coming along. So what that means is that service providers now have competition when they want to sell to the enterprise. It's the enterprises themselves. Enterprises can now go and use this unlicensed spectrum or purchase CBRS or cheap licenses themselves and deploy LTE or 5G on their own, or in the case of 6 gigahertz, take even more advantage of what Wi-Fi has to offer. Okay, so now you can see there's many different decision points that have to be made by enterprises when considering what's out there. So what I'm showing here is where I think enterprise cellular makes most sense. So cellular is really good at mobility. We all know this because when we drive, on the highway, we're buzzing at, in my case, 65 miles an hour, in my colleague's case, 75 miles an hour down the highway. We know the cell phones work. They're really good at mobility. And so in the enterprise setting, there are going to be places where it makes a lot of sense to use a system that is intended for mobility. And what I've shown here is a picture from back in the old days when I used to fly on airplanes. This is one of the airports I visited. And you can see there are things with wings, wheels, or if you look a little bit beyond this building, rails. This is a great place to use enterprise cellular. And it's a really not good place to use Wi-Fi. And I have to say there's a real break point between where it's smart to use Wi-Fi and where it's good to use LTE or later 5G. And that is what I've listed here under the bullet points, enterprise cellular opportunities. For the most part, it's mobility and outdoor where it's in some ways a no-brainer. We've tried to use Wi-Fi in exploration and mining. There are a couple of companies that pioneered that industry, and now cellular is having some success there as well. And there are some other areas as well. But this is the point I want to make. The point I want to make is that enterprise cellular and enterprise Wi-Fi will coexist for a very long time. It's not like enterprise cellular is going to come in and wreck the Wi-Fi market. That is, of course, what you'd hear from service providers, but that is in fact not what's going to happen. There's going to be surprisingly little overlap here because Wi-Fi really did not serve the mobility, or in most cases the enterprise long distance connections that are currently being served by LTE and will be served in the future. And just a little bit more on this topic. Enterprise Wi-Fi right now, or just Wi-Fi in general, we have billions and billions of devices. On this chart it shows 6 billion devices according to our research, and that will go to 10 billion. Wi-Fi is the thing that everyone uses today. And going forward, it's going to be what more and more people are using. If you look on the right, CBRS, which operates in 3.5 gig, as well as other spectrums that are being brought to market for Wi-Fi, like 6 gigahertz, will be on a small number of devices early on because they didn't support them before this year and last year. But going forward, we'll see more devices. So you can expect to see cellular support in many devices. Our forecast is for 8 billion devices in the year 2023. And that is because in the future, cell phones will support 3.5 gig and as well as 6 gigahertz Wi-Fi. So this is the nature of the comparison between Wi-Fi and enterprise cellular devices. Okay, now I'd like to ask my colleague Alan Weckel, who we heard from earlier, to talk to us about another topic which is happening in the campus or the enterprise market, which is architectural shifts in campus switching. Alan, take it away, please.
Great. Thanks, Chris. That was really exciting to see all the different opportunities in Wi-Fi as we go forward. As we look at sort of the broader network and the Ethernet switches that Wi-Fi connects to, we're really going through a significant architecture change. And it's really driven by the cloud. I know when we think of cloud, we usually think of the hyperscalers and how big they are. But at the end of the day, cloud is really getting its way all the way into the campus network. And the architecture is changing. Historically, when we had branch offices or even large businesses, our data center sat in the basement or in the premise, and we tunneled all of our traffic back into that point. That's where we did security, that's where our applications resided, and that's where most of our business workflows sat, in the basement, in our premise, very tightly controlled, and I'd say a fairly simplistic network. But as we look at cloud going forward, and our research indicates that the average employee connects to 12 enterprise applications per day or more, not to mention all the search and social applications that an employee uses. That topology of the past just simply doesn't work. We can't tunnel all of our employees into the basement, and we can't do authentication to cloud apps. It just doesn't make sense. And SD-WAN sort of encompasses that technology change from a box point of view, but really it's something far further than that. We're now connecting directly to cloud applications. That's how businesses do their work, and our topologies are changing. We're now using co-location facilities to house our server infrastructure and our apps. We're now using colo to become multinationals and expand internationally. And the campus has really, really changed in terms of topology. And you can kind of see that as we move towards the next slide. If we think about what's happening in the market historically, we were kind of stuck with two tiers of modular. And for the most part, that tier 3 you see on the top was Cisco. That was how we interjected our services, whether that be our firewall for security, whether that be things like WAN optimization or application delivery. Those services were injected via a blade on a line card. And so we had this sort of architecture that was built purposefully for workers sitting in buildings and applications sitting in the basement or the data center, kind of a top-down and then bottoms-up approach there. That's simply not how we connect today. And it's a tremendous opportunity for the enterprise, as well as just a different architecture there. So if you look on the right, that green colo backbone is still there, as are our cloud services. But now we have a far more simplistic multi-vendor approach in terms of how we connect. We're not tied into Cisco and not tied into legacy architectures. We can kind of connect or build an architecture that's cloud or cloud native. And that involves, one, you can see a different Ethernet switch there, but also a different architecture. And so two things are going on. We've changed the architecture from where we were in the past, but we've also going through a nice speed migration there. So historically, for the last 20 plus years, we've been talking about gig connectivity, right? So gigabit Ethernet to the desktop. That was really introduced when we started doing voice over IP in the early 2000s. And we've been upgrading that switch to another gig switch for the last 20 years. Now we have this new architecture. We're connecting a lot more wireless spectrum that Chris went through earlier. So more bandwidth coming from wireless connectivity. We're also seeing an increase in desktop speeds. We're in the very early stages of doing multi-gig to the desktop. And that's putting additional requirements on the access switch. At the same time, the aggregation layer is also increasing. So we've been, again, kind of in the 1 gig and 10 gig aggregation story for about 20 years. And we're in an exciting time where we're moving towards 25 gig and 100 gig very, very rapidly. And again, with the goal in mind that we want to be connecting to the cloud, and we want these devices to be cloud managed. Again, the IT person needs to scale with the number of devices. And so when in the past that was, say, an IP phone and a desktop, now it's those devices as well as IoT devices, which in our research, we kind of see being in the realm of tens to hundreds of devices per human. All of that sits in an enterprise network, and IT needs to scale with that. So again, cloud managed and cloud first principles really hold true to that. If we go ahead and look at some buzzwords or key terms of what's going on in the market on the next slide, we can kind of see where we are and what's going on. So this chart just shows that we're connecting our data to these states. So a little bit different connectivity out there. It's no longer in our basement, it's in colo. Colo is in a different set of locations. And if we go to the next slide, please, that shows us where we are with these technologies. So today, we're talking about the upgrade to multi-gig, the upgrade to Wi-Fi 6, about cloud managed, and as Chris mentioned, contact tracing. As we go forward, these networks are going to evolve. And again, something that you can only really do in the cloud, you're going to introduce AI and start getting self-provisioning, self-healing networks. The network is going to take on more and more of sort of the control piece, again, to allow the human the IT administrator to scale with the number of devices out there. So not only are we seeing a technology upgrade, again, new Wi-Fi, new Ethernet ports, we're also seeing an increase in the use of cloud and the use of AI. And as we look going forward, again, we're going to begin to see building automation, next-gen Wi-Fi, next-gen Ethernet. There's this nice, robust upgrade cycle that we're going to see in campus networks as it supports the desktop, but also supports these wireless and IoT networks that are going to be really commonplace in the enterprise going forward. And this cloud journey is going to take a different time scale for everybody. So it's not something that suddenly we say turn the clock to 2021 and everyone is on cloud, nor is it going to be something in 2025 where people are not using cloud. This is going to occur in, I'd say, a fairly rapid transition, but a transition over the next several years. And enterprises are really going to embrace this to stay strategically competitive in their verticals. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and thank everybody. Thank Chris for doing an excellent job at the beginning, and go ahead and wrap up. And thank you, and hope that you have a great rest of your conference.